This video is about writing methods that accept parameters and programming using parameters. Consider this problem. We've been asked to write a program that produces the following output on the slide here. This program also accepts some console input. So the program begins by prompting the user for a triangle size. In this particular run of the program, the user has typed a size of 7. And then that will lead the program to draw this text figure in a triangle shape, and the triangle figure will have the number of lines that the user has typed in as the triangle size. So this program has a couple of aspects to it. One is we have to do the user input, and the second is we have to produce the triangle figure that matches the number the user typed. I'd like to use a loop to represent the repetition on each of the 7 lines of the triangle here. And I'd also like to make a method that draws a triangle at a given size. And so we'll accept a parameter to that method. So let's go to our editor for a minute. Maybe we can set up some of the initial code for getting started on this program. Let's write the part of the program that prompts the user for the triangle size and reads that information from the user there. So here's an empty program here. The way that we prompt the user for information is we use an object called scanner. The way to interact with a scanner object is you write a line in your program that says a scanner, and you give the scanner a name. In this program, I'm going to use the name console, and you assign that to a new scanner object. In these parentheses, you write the source of data that the scanner is going to read from. And the source of console input is called system.in. That's a lot like the system.out that we use for println statements. So now that we have this scanner console, we can ask it to read integers and strings and other things from the keyboard. So what we do first is we ask the user for a triangle size. So we say system.out println triangle size. And now to read a value from the scanner, we can call a method on the scanner named nextInt. This method returns an integer value that the user types. And so we can store that into a variable like int triangle size equals console.nextInt. So the value that's returned from this call will be stored into this variable. Maybe just for the moment we could just print the value that the user typed to make sure that that part of the program is working correctly. So maybe I could say something like system.out println you typed plus triangle size. When we compile this program, I think we're going to get an error actually. The program says that it can't find the class scanner. When you want to use scanner in your program, you have to put a statement at the top of your program called an import statement. An import statement includes some of Java's class library resources into your program so that you can use them. The place where you can find this scanner resource is called java.util, and so we write an import statement that says import java.util.star at the top of our program. Has to be at the very top of the file before the public class header. So now the program should compile, and when we run it, it says triangle size, and I'll type 7, and it says you typed 7. So it looks like it's receiving this value and storing it correctly. One subtle problem with the output so far is that the prompting text and my number that I was typing here are on separate lines. So actually a lot of times what we'll do is we'll say system.out print to put the prompt on the same line as the input, and we put a little space there so that the question mark leaves a space between itself and the value that the user is typing. So now we've got the part that prompts the user for the input. And what I'd like to do at this point is I'd like to make a method where I can pass a parameter for a triangle size, and this method will draw a triangle at that size. And so if we're going to do that, we're going to write a method header here that says something like public static void draw triangle. And to represent the fact that the method is parameterized, we're going to put a parameter here in the heading of the method. The syntax for that is to write a type and then a name. So this will be an int parameter. Maybe we'll call it size. Of course, we're probably going to pass this value to store in this parameter, but the two don't have to have the same name. Now, the code to write here is probably the most complicated code in the method, so we're going to have to think about that for a minute before we write it. I'll delete this println statement that we don't need anymore. In main, the call to this method is going to be, we're going to write the word draw triangle, and we're going to pass the size we want to use, which is triangle size. So now we just have to figure out what to put here. Well, what we saw in the previous chapter was that a lot of these text figures had patterns to them, and that we would use loops and tables to figure out those patterns. So the first thing that we usually do when we have a figure like this is we notice that it has sort of a vertical component and a horizontal component to it. And vertically, we're doing one line for each of these 7 numbers here. So basically one line, each up to the value that they passed for the triangle size. And so we'll probably write a piece of code that says something like, for each line from 1 to the size that they pass me, I'm going to print the contents of that line. And if you look at the output we're supposed to produce, the contents of each line consist of some number of spaces here and then some number of stars here after that. And so I think we're going to need to figure out how many spaces to print and then how many stars to print. What we did in the last chapter to figure that out was we made a table. We can use that same trick here. We can say, well, on the first line here, there are 6 spaces and then a single star. On the next line, there are 5 spaces and then 3 stars, and then 4 spaces and 5 stars, and so on. And we get this table that I've drawn here. And if you've watched the previous chapter's videos or read that chapter, you know that the trick here is to first look at the distance between these numbers, the difference between them. So going from 6 to 5 and 5 to 4, we're going down by 1 each time. So the expression that connects the spaces to the line number is going to start with -1 times the line. If we just did -1 times line, we would get -1, -2, -3. We have to shift those numbers up so that they become these numbers. And so to do that, we just have to add 7 to each one. -1 plus 7 makes 6. -2 plus 7 makes 5. -1 times line plus 7. That's the number of spaces we're going to write. We can do a similar calculation for the stars. When we are on the first line, we print 1 star. When the second line, we print 3 stars. And so that's going up by 2 every time, +2, +2, and so forth. And so the expression that we're going to start with for the stars here is 2 times the line. And then if we used it just 2 times line, we would get 2, 4, 6. And we have to shift them to be 1, 3, 5. And so each one is just too large by 1. 2 times line minus 1. So if we go to our code and we insert those expressions, these 2 expressions here for spaces and stars, we can hopefully get the output that we're looking for. The way to incorporate that expression into our code, of course, is to make a loop that prints a single space character this many times and a single star character that many times. So let's go back to our code now. Let's make a loop that says space equals 1, space less than or equal to, our expression was -1 times the line plus 7 and space plus plus. And inside that loop, we'll print a single space. And now we'll have a similar loop for the stars. The expression we had for stars was 2 times the line minus 1. And inside that loop, we'll print a single star. The last thing we need to do on each line is we have to end the line so that we'll go to the next line of output. Okay, so there we have a draw triangle method. We're calling it from main here. And so let's compile this and see if we get something reasonable as our output. I'm going to run the program. Triangle size, I type 7. Hey, we've got a triangle. Looks like we're in business. Just to be safe, let's test it with a couple of other values. Let's type triangle size of 5. And now triangle size of 10. That one doesn't look so good. In fact, the one at size 5 didn't look so good either, but the problem was more subtle. It's indented and it shouldn't be. So that indicates that we don't have the right number of spaces here after all. I think the fact that this number here is 7 comes from the fact that our size we were typing was 7. And so actually, I think the right value that we want to put here is size. Whatever the size is, that's how many spaces we have to lead our lines with. So why don't we try that and see if that helps any. So let's run again with size 7. Looks good. Let's run again with size 10. And now that one also looks good. So here we are. We've got a method that draws our triangle with parameters. Now, one thing that is not ideal about this method is there's a little bit of repetition. We have these loops to print single characters like this. So that's unfortunate that we have that redundancy. So actually, if we want to take a little bit further advantage of parameters, we can clean this code up even more. What we could do is we could write a method that prints a certain character a certain number of times. So those would be the parameters to that method. We pass them, and then we don't have to write a for loop now to repeatedly print the same character if we would have this method. So this method could be called something like public static void print string. So you tell me the string you want to print and the number of times you want to print it, and I will do that. So let's make a string parameter here and an int parameter for how many times you want to print it. So basically, we're going to do this inside of that method. We're going to say something like, we want to loop this number of times. So let's just make a loop that goes from 1 to that number. And inside the loop, we will print the string that was passed to us, s. So now that's a pretty short and simple method there, but if we have it, it really helps us make our other code look cleaner, because watch what we can do with this for loop here. We can basically turn that whole for loop off and replace it with a single call that says, I want to print the string. We're printing the space string, and the number of times we're printing it is this many times. -1 times the line plus the size. We're also going to print stars here, and instead of using this for loop for that, we're going to print a star string 2 times line -1 times. And so actually, if I remove these comments now, that draw triangle method is much shorter. In fact, the overall program is much more readable at this point with this extra method thrown in. So let's make sure it still works at least. We'll run it again with a triangle of size 7, and there we go. So parameters really helped us make this program a lot more readable and usable. If we wanted to parameterize the program a little bit further, it would be possible for us to add a parameter to replace this star here. So let's look at a variation of this program where we also prompt the user to tell us what character to fill in the triangle with. So for example, maybe here after we prompt the user for the triangle size, we'll ask them, what character do you want to appear on each letter of the triangle? So we'll say something like system out print fill character. And now we'll read that character from them as a string. The method for reading a string from the scanner is called console.next, and it returns a string value. So now imagine if we pass not only the size, but also this fill character as a second parameter. Down here in this method, we'll have to adjust the heading to accept that parameter, string fill. And instead of this star here, we'll print that fill character, whatever they typed on the keyboard up above in main. So let's take a look at what that would look like. So the triangle size, I still want size 7, but now the fill character, instead of a star, let's use a different character like a hash sign. And now we get a triangle of 7 hashes.